Hey class, in this lecture I want to talk about what lies behind the moral law. We talked in our second lecture about Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God. And I mentioned in that lecture that I didn't feel like the philosophical arguments for the existence of God were the strongest. And I want to talk a little bit about that in this lecture because I believe while the philosophical arguments are strong, especially intelligent design, I think that the moral law is a much, much stronger proof that there is a God. Now, to review, we talked in the last lecture about the law of nature and the law of human nature. Now, the law of nature tells us what things within human nature do. And we gave the example of gravity. A rock falls. Okay, that is the law of nature. But the law of human nature tells us what humans ought to do and what they ought not to do. And now I want to talk in this lecture about what lies behind that. And I think that this is going to really be such an important thing for you and I to wrap our minds around as we talk about apologetics and going out into our culture and interacting with people. And after this lecture, we're going to talk for 3 lectures about the problem of pain and evil. But I really, really want us to focus in on this idea of there being a moral law, which was what we talked about last lecture, and what lies behind it. Now, there's 2 views as to what lies behind the moral law. The first view would be called the materialist view, and the second view would be called the theistic view. So the materialist view we find in C.S. Lewis' book, Mere Christianity. I'm going to read his definition of it. C.S. Lewis says, people who take this view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed. Nobody knows why. And that the matter, behaving in certain fixed ways, has just happened by sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets. And by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets. And so, some of the matter on this earth came alive. And then, by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. So when we talked about intelligent design, it really is mind-boggling that people can believe in evolution, that people can believe that everything that is today just came out of nothing. But the reason that I said that I feel like this moral law is a stronger argument is because it really just takes the intelligent design philosophical view of God and takes it a step further. Like, when you look at the human body, when you look at the eyeball, wouldn't you say that that's proof that there's an intelligent designer? But then when you go a step further and when you look at the moral law that each one of us have, how could that have come about by chance? How could it be that every human being in the universe knows that stealing is wrong, knows that we ought to keep our promise? So this leads us to the religious view of what lies behind the moral law. And this religious view is the idea that there is a mind behind the universe, that anything more than anything else we know, there's a mind. It is conscious, it has a purpose, it prefers one thing to another. And the Christian view, obviously there's many religions that would hold to the theistic view, but the Christian view is, and we talked, I mentioned to you at the start of this class, I want to take a step further, the goal of this class is not just to give you evidence of the existence of God, but it is to prove the validity of the Christian truths, the claims of Jesus, and it's for you and I to realize that this God is personal and wants to know us. So the Christian view is this. We would agree with David Hume, as we talked about in our second lecture, that we ought not try and suppose this God from our human understanding as some sort of superhuman. But the Christian belief is that this mind, this God, is personal. He has given us His name. His name is Yahweh. And Yahweh has revealed Himself to us. He wants us to know Him. So we have two views. We have the materialist view and we have the theistic view. Now I want to take some time in this class and I want to talk about science because I think this is so important for us in our culture today. There is so much of this going on in our churches where churches will look down upon science, and for some good reason, by the way. And then when you step outside of the church, science and scientists and those who believe in science look down upon the Christian church. And honestly, I think that so much of it is a misunderstanding and science not playing its proper role and Christians not playing their proper role. And so I don't want to go too far into this, but I definitely want to mention it in this class. You cannot find the correct view of what lies behind the moral law with science. You just can't do it. Science's role is to observe things in the universe. And this has to do with the law of nature, not the law of human nature. That's not its purpose. That's not its role. That's what C.S. Lewis says in his book. He says if someone is a real scientist, they'll stick to their field, which is the law of nature. It's not a scientist's job to give us what lies behind the moral law. It's not the scientist's job to tell us anything about the origins of the universe. That's not science. Science is simply to observe. The role of science is to observe. Science gives or explains to us the law of nature. There's nothing against science. It just doesn't cover the law of human nature. The question of why something comes into being, the question of why there is a universe, these are things that science cannot answer. In our world today, many disbelieve Christianity because they think Christianity contradicts science. And I want to give two notes on this. So listen carefully. This is so important. Number one, first of all, some Christians have treated science with disgust. Okay, that's just a fact. And in fairness to Christians, many scientists, this leads me to number two, many scientists have stepped outside of their realm and began to conclude that which is outside of their field. So scientists have stepped outside of their role, and Christians are now looking down upon science because scientists are stepping outside of their role. And Christians, too, are stepping outside of their role. I want to talk in one of our lectures later about one of the misunderstandings about what the Bible is. And we'll talk a little bit about what the Bible is and what the Bible is not. Christians, too, have been guilty of stepping outside of their role. And the role of a Christian, especially the role of a pastor or teacher, is to explain the Scriptures. And within that, we have to look at the purpose of Scriptures. And the Scriptures are not there primarily to tell us about the origins of the universe. And so I think both Christians and scientists have both been guilty of stepping outside of their role. But the real point that I want to make in this class is this. Scientists cannot give us anything to do with the law of human nature. They can only give us the law of nature. I would say to the Christian who is skeptical of science, and I would say to the scientist who is skeptical of Christian the same thing. Stick to your field and learn from one another. Science is very useful and necessary to observe the laws of nature. And Christianity, I believe, is useful and necessary to observe the laws of human nature. I believe that Christianity, through the scriptures, answers the question of the moral law. I believe it gives us everything we need to know as human beings about what lies behind the moral law. I love what C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity. He says, suppose scientists did discover everything in the universe. To explore every inch of every galaxy, wouldn't we still have the questions, why is there a universe? Why does the universe continue to go on and on? Does the universe have any meaning? Yes, we would still have those questions. And this leads us to talk about us as human beings. There is one thing in the universe that we do not just observe, but we are, and that is human beings. I want us to stop in this class, and I want us just to talk about human beings. Myself, yourself. We can observe human beings better than we can observe anything else in the universe. We almost have like some kind of insider knowledge on human beings because we are one. And so if we're talking about the existence of God, the best place to study the universe and the existence of God is to study human beings. And I think Christians have such a leg up on this, and I do believe our view of humanity and human nature is true. We find that men are under a moral law which they did not make and cannot quite figure out, and cannot quite forget, So let me say that again. We find that men are under a moral law which they did not make and cannot quite forget, and which they know they ought to obey. Now I want us to think with C.S. Lewis here. Lewis wants us to imagine that we were not a human. Imagine that you were a stone or a piece of broccoli, and we were observing humans. Now this is kind of a crazy analogy, but I think it really takes our brains to a place they haven't been probably. All right, so imagine that you're not a person. Imagine that you're a piece of broccoli, and you are observing human beings. Okay? Can you imagine that? Now, obviously, if you're a broccoli, you would have to have a brain and reasoning skills. But just imagine that you were a piece of broccoli and you're observing humans. We wouldn't have any idea that humans have a moral law. We would see men and women act, but we wouldn't know that they ought to act a certain way. In the same way, we have no way of knowing whether or not broccoli has a moral law because we are not broccoli. Okay, so here's the point that C.S. Lewis is trying to make to us. We don't know anything about any other category other than human beings because we are human beings. But because we are human beings, we know that human beings have a moral law. We're talking about materialism and theism. We're talking about everything for a reason with a purpose versus everything for no reason. Everything came into existence, there's no reason for it. We're talking about a creator God who created everything for a purpose, and we're talking about there's nothing behind the universe. This is what we're comparing. Since we cannot see the Creator because He is not matter, but the power that created the matter, He is not a human, but the being that created the humans. So since we cannot see Him, the only thing we can observe is matter and human life. And in human life, we have inside information because we are human. And what we see in ourselves is that we have a moral law. Okay, so in summary, let me try to simplify this. God is not a human. God is a spirit. And He reveals Himself to humans, within humans, by the moral law. So the moral law is something that presses down on each one of us within us, that proves to us that there is someone that's giving us that moral law. There's someone that requires something of you. There's someone that expects something of you. That is the proof that there is a God like none other. At the end of the day, when each one of us lays our head on our pillow at night, there's something that's driving us that we ought to be a certain way, that we mean something, that we have purpose, that our life has meaning, that we're expected to do something. In my opinion, the greatest proof of a creator God is ourselves. Lewis gives the analogy of a mail truck, and I love this. If you were to see a mail truck and he was driving to all of the different houses and he was opening up mailboxes and putting something in, and he finally comes to your mailbox and you wave at the mailman and he drives off, and you open up your mailbox and you pull envelopes out. Well, you would assume that he was putting envelopes in all the other mailboxes. You wouldn't have proof of that, but you would assume it because that's what he put in your mailbox. The only packet, C.S. Lewis says, that I am allowed to open is man, especially the man I call myself. When I open it, I find I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. If I could get inside of broccoli, I do not suppose I would find the same thing, just as if I could get inside other mailboxes, I would not find the same packages. I may find that someone compels the stone to obey its law and invites the human to obey his, but in both cases, I find there is a sender of letters, a power behind the facts, a guide. And so the reality is, when you get mail, you know that there is someone who's delivering the mail. This is the idea that C.S. Lewis is trying to put in our heads. The moral law is telling us that there's a sender, that there's a giver, that there's a guide, that there's a force and a power that's compelling us to live in a certain way. And that is the strongest argument for the existence of God. Now, does the moral law prove the God of the Bible? Well, that is another question for another class, but I don't think it's, I want to be respectful towards those who struggle to believe in the existence of God, but I don't think it's at any point and in any way logical to believe there's anything other than a mind behind the moral law. And I believe that with all of my heart. All right, next class we're going to go into the problem of pain, and we're going to attempt to answer the question, if God is all loving and all powerful, why does evil exist in the world he created? I'm really looking forward to it. I'll see you then.